David Kilcullen, welcome. So there's this disturbing warning that's come to light in recent hours from the FBI of armed protests planned for state capitals and for Washington, and talk about storming buildings. What's your assessment of just how volatile and dangerous this next week will be in the run-up to the inauguration?
I think it will be quite volatile. This particular event, which is called peaceful armed protests, has been circulating around on various social media and right-wing websites for a couple of months, actually. I've been aware of it since November. Others have pointed to it in the past couple of months. It seems to have picked up a little bit of steam since the events of last week at the Capitol. And today in the US, the mainstream media has finally picked up on this and have started reporting it. The FBI are essentially reflecting back what is on this flyer, which has been circulating, and it calls for a peaceful but armed demonstration at the Capitol on the 17th of January at noon, but also at every one of the 50 state capitals across the US. And I think that what we're seeing here is the FBI reacting, you might even say out of an excess of caution, to the fact that they and other law enforcement were seen as very caught by surprise and flat-footed last week at the Capitol. It still remains to be seen how serious the event will turn out to be, and I think that's why we all need to keep watching it pretty closely.
And yeah, what's your assessment of the danger from this group or loose grouping? What can you tell us about it?
Well, it's all it is right now is effectively a meme, albeit a very detailed one, with a call to action that is circulating on the internet. So it's not known to be associated with any particular group. Unlike the groups that demonstrated last week at the Capitol, there's no single organising website. It hasn't had any public endorsement from people like the president in the case of last week. So it's really an open question as to how many people are going to turn up. One of the things that was unusual about last week's event was that a very large number of people actually turned up on the day. There have been a number of pre-planned Million MAGA March, truckers strike, and other things since the election that have basically fizzled and no one's turned up. This could turn out to be the same. I suspect that the risk is going to be actually a lot less in Washington, where there are now 15,000 troops on the streets, as well as police from all the surrounding states, as well as New York and New Jersey. So Washington's pretty heavily locked down at this point. But of course, if you're concentrating that much of a military and law enforcement resource in the nation's capital, by definition, you're denuding some of the other sites where we might see these other nationwide protests take place. So I don't think the 17th is going to pass without incident, but it's a bit hard to see just yet exactly how big that incident's going to be.
So what strategy should the various security agencies in the US be using right now to limit the chances of this becoming violent?
I think that actually it starts with political leaders, and I think we all need to be hoping that political leaders on both sides of politics will start to take steps to reduce the temperature. Law enforcement alone can't fix a political crisis where half of the country believes that the other half stole the recent election. It's a very common trigger for revolutions and insurgencies all over the world when that circumstance exists. Last week only made it worse, and I think we're sort of giving law enforcement a hospital pass if we think that they're going to be able to recover from a political situation that's actually been created by the media, social media, and politicians. So I think this is a time when the nation as a whole, but in particular people in those roles, need to really step up and say, you know, let's get a grip and sort of step back from the brink, because, you know, we could very well be on the brink of a much more serious level of violence than we've seen since the height of the Black Lives Matter protests last summer.
So is it essential that President Donald Trump comes out now with a very clear statement calling for calm ahead of the inauguration?
I do think that he does retain a very significant degree of influence over, roughly 74 million people that voted for him, of whom about 50 million think the election was stolen. So if he was to do that, I think that would help. But it's worth noting that there are more extreme groups in that mix who have lost confidence in President Trump and are now seeing him as a traitor or as a failure, and are talking about taking up arms in their own right and not relying on him for some sort of last-minute save. It's also worth mentioning it's not a unified set of groups, and there are a lot of people also on the far right describing this 17th of January event as a trap and saying that we really need to avoid this because look at what happened to our friends and colleagues last week. This could be 10 times worse. So I think there's leverage there if politicians on all sides, but particularly the president, were to try to reduce the temperature and take this off the boil.
And David Kilcullen, just what's it been like for you witnessing this happen in the US while being there yourself?
Well, it's rather strange. I mean, I've spent most of my professional career looking at foreign countries that are experiencing insurgencies and figuring out how to deal with them. I wrote in The Australian last week that this looks a lot like the opening moves of a colour revolution, and I've been around a couple of those. And I think there's a sort of a cognitive dissonance when you see it happening in your own city or in your own country where you live. And I think for Australians, I'm sure there's a similar sort of head shaking, how can this be happening?
Yeah. I think, David, unfortunately, we've got to leave it there because we're coming to time, but always really good to talk to you. Thanks for your perspective.